And of course, you can come with your own opinions, but not life stories. Okay? They might be interesting, and they probably are, but you know, we want to have a discussion here. So who is the first one out? Right? Just tell us your name, short introduction, and then fire ahead.
My name is Sufyan. I'm a business student. My question is to Iyad. So when you talk about different societies, like the Islamist one, that kind of society based on what they think is Islamic rules from previous times, and you have democracy. And when I listen to those people you would say call Islamists, they talk about Islam as the perfect solution to everything. And when I talk about other group, which sometimes when I listen to you too, you talk about like democracy or being like the right thing. But I don't see as like, is democracy necessarily the right thing, the perfect system? Because it's not, it's just a man-made system like many systems. So what do you see as the way we should govern a society, and how should that be?
Well, democracy and human rights, both paradigms are based upon a very simple idea, the idea that we are equal. The idea of equality translates to us having human rights, the same rights, so I have the same human rights as you. And also, I have a say and you have a say, we have a vote. Unchecked democracy doesn't exist really anywhere. I think the idea here that if you remove human rights from democracy, if you remove that paradigm from democracy, that means we can all vote. We can find, for example, the fattest guy in the room, and you know, we can say, you know, if we're hungry, we can always eat him. It's a vote, right? We all voted. It's the majority rules, but that's not really what democracy is. Democracy really is not simply elections, and it's not simply the idea of majority rules. And I think that's why many philosophers also at the same time, many philosophers throughout history, they refer to democracy as mob rule. Democracy needs to be checked by certain conditions that have to say that these things are not beyond, some things are beyond discussion. Some things are not up to the vote. Some of these, for example, are human rights. The fact that, you know, we basically cannot vote other people's rights away. And some of them are, you know, like some people take it to the point of saying that there are certain laws which derive from human rights that also cannot be debated. Which is basically a viewpoint that says that we should not have a lot of laws, legal minimalism or minimalism. As for me personally, keep in mind that I grew up in the Middle East. So I grew up in a system where I did not have a vote. I did not have any political rights. I spoke about political rights every day to the point until I got in trouble and I was jailed and I was expelled because of it. But the irony here is that I never actually had political rights any day of my life. I still don't have political rights. I'm still a refugee. It's different for, and that's why sometimes when people say, hey, you know, I lived in a democracy, it's not all it's cracked up to be. I'm like, you never lived, did you actually live under a dictatorship? I mean, that's something that I ask. I'm sure that's not your question, but I'm just, you know, taking the question forward. It's easy for us to talk from a position of, you know, about experiences that you haven't really gone through yourself. As for me, because I lived in this kind of situation where I saw like I saw the government being very aggressive towards society, I developed a very deep distrust towards the government. And you know, like Scandinavian countries in general don't have that. They have you actually look at the government with trust. As for me, I have a very deep distrust of authority. This is why I call myself a libertarian. And for that reason, I prefer a government as small as possible, as limited as possible.
Okay, one more?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up some. Like, I agree with you on libertarianism, but that's like opposite of what we have in Norway, I would say. But when you talk, but still you need some rules that we need to agree on. You talk about human rights, but we can't actually agree on even them. And a lot of people would say like they're like westernized. They're based on a Western context. And in some situations, human rights would be different if they were made in China or in the Middle East. So if we can't agree on these kind of things, how can we have a system based on that?
Well, actually, we agree on human rights. If you actually take a survey about human rights everywhere, you end up with the same human rights in the end. You might have slight differences. There's a reason why we call it human rights, not Western rights. And there's a reason why we have a UN Declaration of Human Rights that all member organizations of the UN agree upon. If you actually ask this question, what should a human right, what does a human need in order to experience his full humanity? You kind of end up, whether you start from Islamic principles or you start from secular principles, you end up with the same set of rights. There might be some nuances. Like, for example, people in Bolivia, they gave more of environment rights. They said that the environment also has rights. People, for example, in in Latin America, they also spoke more about economic rights. However, you always end up with the same rights. In fact, if you talk about it from an Islamic point of view, as early as the 2nd century Hijri, Muslims started debating what is the underpinning of Sharia. On what basis is Sharia actually based? And this is because they started to speak about how do we extend Sharia, how do we extend the law towards events that we have absolutely, they're no precedent for it. They didn't happen at the time of the Prophet or the Sahaba. And that's when we started thinking about another paradigm, which is Maqasid al-Sharia, which is basically saying that, eventually what did they come up with? They said that the underpinnings of Sharia, the purpose of Sharia is protection of rights, protection of life, liberty, property, basically the 5 maqasid. The 5 maqasid are life, faith or religion, progeny or family, property, and what was the last one? Intellect, al-aql. And if you look at it, you can easily divert, and again, the maqasid are not, the maqasid themselves are not written stone. They're not basically revelation. So the maqasid themselves reflect the mentality of the people who are actually accessing the text. So actually, that's why we need more diversity. We need women to look at the maqasid and say, is it valid? We need people who are like minorities or underprivileged to look at the maqasid and say, is this valid? But in the end, you come up with the same kind of principles because human experiences across the globe is really the same. So I don't completely agree when you say that it's not exactly, we don't agree on it. I think we actually agree on it to a large extent.
All right, enough about Sharia. More questions about radicalization?
Yeah, so I attended one of the previous talks here by Iyad, and my mind was a bit slow, so when I cycled back home, my question came to mind. And it kind of it fits in here also a bit indirectly, and it's about dogmatism. And the other time you had talked about, so you relativized Sharia and fiqh text and hadith text by saying, well, you have to look at the historical and social context in which these texts were made, and so on. This it all sounds very reasonable and logical to me as a Western Western trained person. But on my way home, I thought, oh, what would Iyad say about the historical context of the Quranic text? Are these exempted from this kind of critical perspective? And so I was very curious about it, because that's a kind of red line for most Muslims, and they just say, well, they came from God, and we don't need to discuss any further. And also, of course, I'd like to hear a bit more from Ahmed.
Yeah. So my issue with the question is that it doesn't relate to radicalization. So I don't want to I don't want to appear not to be answering your question. But we can always communicate about it in full later. But I can give you my short answer right now. There is the historicity here of the Quran relates. Let me start with this, and maybe that's an analogy that maybe it can cut through a lot of explanation. One of the things I did early in my career was to do animation. I had an animation workshop. This was one of my businesses back in the UAE before I was expelled. And one thing we studied a lot was Japanese cartoons. Why Japanese cartoons? Because they're very, 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 very local. It's almost like they're actually not made for international audience. They're only made for Japanese people. What was really interesting to me is the fact that everybody likes them, even though they're made at an extremely local level for a very local audience. And the lesson that I came up with it is that, some people talk, for example, about the fact that the Quran is talking to a desert society and a commercial society. So a lot of the metaphors, a lot of the imagery, kind of relates to that. But I also find that when you are actually if you speak too abstractly and too generally speaking, you don't hit that. You don't hit that in the heart of the recipient. Metaphors, when you actually bring people down to your story, it's actually more emotionally strong. It's actually more emotionally, effective. Now, I know this doesn't answer your question. It's basically about historical criticism of the Quran, but because that's a very, very wide question, relating to many things, including, what was the earliest, what is the earliest Quran that we have? What is the social context which helps us understand the Quran? What is the linguistic context with which we understand the Quran? There were no dictionaries, for example. How do we know that this word means this, etc.? There are words, for example, that are repeated many times in the Quran. So we can actually find it from the context. We can define it from there. There are other words that's repeated only once. How do we find out what it means? These are, unfortunately, it's beyond the scope of one answer. It's beyond the scope of this topic. So it's a very interesting question, but I'd like to have a conversation with you about that, but not to monopolize this.
Yeah. So Iyad chickens out. The next question.
My name is Betul van Anger. I'll make it short because I have a question for each one of you. I was looking at your points of the populist narratives, and for me it seems like similar to the seed of fascism. So would you say that radicalization has the same seed as a fascism? And to the other brother, would you say that Islamophobia is breeding on radicalization and vice versa?
Well, fascism is another one of those words which is also academics kind of dispute how to define it. But yes, I look at early 20th century fascism as basically a narrative of populism, a narrative of the same kind of radicalization that you look at. The difference here is that, let's talk, for example, about Hitler, for example. You look at the populist narrative and you see that it actually fits a lot. It fits why? Because as I mentioned again in the presentation, the lived reality of Germans in the 1930s kind of matched that. There were German society was one of the most advanced once. It was one of the most literate and the most cultured in Europe. So they had that thing about we were once great. They were humiliated after the First World War, and they went through a lot of suffering, a lot of economic suffering, and also the fact is that they were not actually defeated. They were not like the Allies in the First World War. The Allies did not really make it to Berlin. It was basically just a very punitive treaty. So when Hitler was saying this, it kind of matched the reality that Germans were going through. And again, we have to remember that he actually did not win a majority. The story is a lot more nuanced. When I compare this to our populists today, I feel that, let's talk about Trump, for example. And I don't want to go to the point of comparing Trump to Hitler, but I'll tell you why. The reason is Hitler was more convincing. Trump had to invent a loser America to make the narrative fit. The narrative actually doesn't fit. America, in a sense, first of all, it was never homogeneous. It's declining. It's declining in importance in the world, but it's still a very, very important country. And in a sense, if you think about it as white America, it makes sense. Because America is becoming more diverse. So the fact is that, to answer your question, fascism is a form of populism, but our current populists today are not as convincing as the populists from before, and that's why I don't believe they're going to win. I believe that their resurgence is actually, it's not a new renaissance, it's their last stand.
So yeah, on Islamophobia, we're working on a book which basically takes the radicalization roadmap and shows how it applies to different groups, whether you take Muslim extremists or Islamophobes and neo-Nazis and white supremacists in Western countries, or even Hindu nationalists in India right now. It's possible to trace the exact same 7 steps onto them, and they do it in their different ways by referring to a different historical period or even inventing a historical period like Trump. They either talk about a historic oppression or they invent a historic oppression or, reinterpret the facts to fit. But they all construct the same thing of we're separate, we're different, we're better than you and you're oppressing us. With Islamophobes, it's Muslims are coming to our country and stealing our jobs and they're destroying our culture, and it's not the same country anymore, and once upon a time it was great. So if it's the exact same pattern. So
are you saying that Islamophobia actually breeds radicalization?
Well, we've seen it. We've seen it in Norway. We've seen people, Anders Breivik felt so strongly about his oppression as a white man that he thought he'd have to commit terrorist attacks in order to get people to pay attention. If that's not radicalization, I don't know what is.
All right, another question here.
Thank you. The question goes first to you, Iyad, but the answer can come from both of you. In the introduction, you mentioned something. You said that radicalization was a reflex of an innate instinct in human beings. And this was very interesting for me because, okay, it's universal, but then how do you solve it? Like, what's the solution? And on what level should it be?
Well, when I answer this question, I normally ask a very strange question to the audience. What is the sound of a baby chimpanzee? Or a baby gorilla? A baby, an infant who's basically just born. Anyone knows? They're very, 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 very silent. Compare that to the sound of a human baby. Like if there's a human baby, within earshot, you'll hear it. And why do I ask this? What is the difference? Because our closest genetic relatives are basically, these animals. The question is, why is it that their babies are very, very, very silent and our babies are very, very loud? Think about it a little bit. Who would venture a guess? Yeah.
The ape babies are evolved or to avoid
predator.
by the male.
Which means that human babies evolved in a tribal setting. Human babies evolved in a setting where if they scream, the people around it are not predators. They're basically, friends and family, are basically the rest of the tribe. The reason why I bring this up is because we were tribal even before we were Homo sapiens. That's why it's so deeply enshrined in us. The idea of tribalism is just so deeply enshrined in us. The question is, what do we do about it? And I think that the solution is to build open tribes. I think the problem is not the tribe. The problem is when we actually say that the tribe is based upon something that you cannot accept new members into the tribe. When you say the tribe is based upon ethnicity, you can't change. Like, I can become a Norwegian citizen, okay? I can become part of Team Norway, but I cannot become an ethnic Norwegian. It's too late for me, right? And by the way, the same thing applies to religion to a large extent, because we actually think that, a lot of us think that, yeah, you can adopt a different religion. And that was very true in a different age. But today, religion has become so caught up in our own identity that changing faiths is almost like changing who you are. There was a point of time, actually, when I think, for example, about the stories of the early Islamic generations and the Sahaba, it was almost like they're actually shifting. I don't want to be misunderstood here, but it's almost like they're shifting political positions. It's almost like they're basically adopting this liberation struggle And they're saying that, you know what, you're right about bigotry, you're right about tribalism, you're right about the fact that, you know, there's bigger purpose for our existence, etc. It was not really all that caught up in identity at that moment, and that's why it was easy to change. Right now, we're, you know, 1400 years later, or, you know, if we're talking about Christianity, then 2000 years later, what we call religion is really 9 parts culture and 1 part faith. So I, as a Muslim today, I believe that when we emphasize identity, and when we emphasize Islam as identity, or religion as identity, we take away something from the religion. And that's why, basically, to just land on your question, build open tribes.
Can the tribe encompass the whole world population?
Well, they're always going to be, the thing is we're always going to have multiple identities. So, you know, like Ahmed mentioned with the left-handed, I'm always going to be team left-hand. But at the same time, you know, politically I'm something else. When it comes to sports, I'm something else. I'm different, I'm part of different tribes. I don't think it's ever going to encompass the entire world, but I think our struggle for social justice is basically never ending. But again, those tribes are going to be, you know, kind of overlapping. And I think we have to get used to the fact that we have multiple identities.
I disagree with that. I'd say that in the same way as we have, a lot of people have a European identity today, and it's something that we noticed, young people noticed in the UK after the Brexit vote, that we've been cut off from, you know, a massive continent that we could travel through freely, we could live in, we could work in. A lot of people in Europe today, you know, aren't that tied to their national identity. They feel like I'm part of this bigger thing. I can work where I want. You know, it doesn't really affect me if I was born here and I move here. I'm French, I can learn Spanish, whatever. We've never had that kind of identity in history before, and there's nothing preventing us from evolving something even bigger in the future and saying that we're all part of, you know, a common humanity, and our problems are things like disease and global warming, not things like he stole my job and he's destroying my culture.
Although, you know, the fastest way for us to actually build a human identity is to be invaded by aliens, really.
Yes, I have 2 more on the question list. You first, Mas?
I was going to ask you a question about something you said. I think you said we should talk about reform in Islam. But first, just a quick comment to, I mean, your team left hand, his team right hand, but both of you are part of team hands. So in that sense, what Ahmed is saying, it makes sense. That you can have a larger identity, even though you're part of a smaller group, you're still part of a larger identity. Anyways, back to my question, and reform in Islam, and I understand you talked about Salafi Islam in depth at the last talk. I wasn't present, but I do have a large group of close Salafi friends, and all of them consider themselves a part of a reform movement in Islam. Although it is a back-to-basic, puritanistic reform movement, they still consider themselves a reform movement. You also have groups like Ahmadi Muslims that also consider themselves part of a reform movement, but have a distinct theological approach that ends up, that makes them or makes most Muslims disregard them unanimously and collectively from the Muslim majority. And what I'm wondering is that when you say reform, talk about reform in Islam, what type of reform do you have in mind, or are there presently any groups, be that in the West or in Muslim majority countries, that align with your idea of reform in Islam?
Well, that's an excellent question, and you know, it kind of lands exactly where you know where we want the project to land. So, because it's a wide question, I don't think I'll be able to satisfy you completely. But the last 3 articles in our series is going to be only about reform, by the way. So we'll have actually as an entire event only about that question. But to answer your question, let me first say that. When I use the word reform, I'm actually translating from Arabic. And in Arabic, it's islah. Islah in Arabic simply means to make something fit, to make something relevant. So when I think about Islamic reform, I actually thinking about making Islam relevant once again in our lives. It really hit closest to me when I went through a personal crisis because, I was kind of jailed and exiled from my country. And there were many points when I had to make very, very difficult decisions that would affect many people's lives. There were points of time when I felt that the formulaic approach to religion was lacking. It was not giving me the guidance or the kind of satisfaction that I needed. So let's start with that point. The point is that when we say reform, many Muslims kind of are taken aback because they think, oh, do you mean you want to change religion? We don't want to change the religion. We basically want to make it relevant again. The other point is that I think it's very important for us to define what we mean by reform. So when we actually look at Islamic studies, we find that it's always split into different disciplines. There is a discipline, for example, which deals with Sufism or spirituality. There is a discipline that deals with aqidah or creed, or basically your belief system. And then there's talking about fiqh, which is what is proper action? What is the proper way to act? I don't hear a lot of people saying that we need to change, we need reform Sufism, or we need to basically get rid of it, or we want to basically change, change what it means, etc., in a radical way. Of course, there is, talk about, for example, some Sufi practices which border on superstition. But when it comes to the essence of spirituality, not many people actually, it's not a topic which is talked about a lot. Similarly, when it comes to ilm al-kalam or aqaid in general, not a lot of people say, hey, we have to change the way that our belief system. It's really about fiqh in the end. It's really about, are we following the right rules for these societies or for these times? So let's focus the attention. I mean, we're not actually talking about all of Islam. We're talking about a very specific point over here. The third point that I would say is that reform in the end is an internal conversation, because who's going to decide in the end what kind of Islam is mainstream? It's really because you're never going to get everyone to agree. There's always going to be a spectrum of ideas in any society, in any healthy society. Some people are going to believe this, some people are going to believe that. And of course, just to answer, just to refer to your point about Salafism being a reform movement, many people bring that up when we talk about Muslim Reformation because they borrow a metaphor from the Christian Reformation, and the basically Reformation with a capital R. And I reject that because we didn't really have anything similar to the Christian or the Catholic Church in Islam. So basically, it doesn't really fit so much. It's kind of an example of historical relativism that doesn't really work so much. But in the end, in order for us to reform, in the end really means shift the mainstream. What is the mainstream right now? The mainstream right now is very Salafi, and it's very legalistic. It's overly obsessed with rules. It doesn't speak a lot about values. It speaks about rules a lot, and it's very dogmatic. It's quite dogmatic. And when it comes to certain issues like for example, human rights, women's rights, etc., it's rather illiberal. The kind of reform we're talking about is shift the mainstream. And I hope, we will get the chance to actually talk a lot more about that in a separate debate and 3 full articles. But I'm sorry I can't monopolize the discussion by talking just about this particular point. But it's a very interesting question. Thank you so much.
We can always take it up next time. You still have a question? So this gentleman will ask his question in Arabic, and you. Is okay? All right. Do it in Arabic.
Hi, I am Mohammed Asakar. First of all, I would like to ask you in English. If I find any difficult word, I will translate in Arabic. First of all, I would like to thank you very much for a great job, because we are really suffering from this general reputation about related between Muslim and terrorist and radical. My question is, do you think radical as made from powerful country like UK and USA just to use it for politician purpose. Like what's happened in Syria right now.
So basically, just to understand your question, you're asking whether Western countries are basically inflaming certain radicalization, forms of radicalization, or they're basically helping it or assisting it intentionally.
Yes.
Okay, so this is a narrative which is actually quite widespread in a lot of the Arab world, and I only left the Middle East in 2014. I lived my entire life before that then. And I remember specifically when ISIS came up, a lot of Muslims were so horrified that they thought, these people cannot be among us. They can't be Muslim. They have to be a foreign, there has to be some foreign conspiracy or a foreign hand behind it or something like that. Now, my position is that while, like for example, when we talk, let's take a specific example. Let's look at Iraq, for example, and the United States versus ISI. ISI were the precursors of ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq, before they became Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. When the US invaded Iraq in 2003, there were no jihadists in Iraq. Within a couple years, there was an enormous jihadist insurgency in Iraq. It was basically like a Christmas present for Al-Qaeda. And this kind of makes you wonder, did they do it? It was so much ineptitude, and I don't want to make the debate about the Iraq war because Usman kind of warned me before that, but there was so much ineptitude that you almost feel like, were they really, like, was this really unintentional, or were they really that inept? And after a lot of research, I can tell you that they are really that inept. It really is the fact that tyrants and foreign intervention, they kind of feed off each other. They rely upon each other for a lot of their narratives. So basically, a terrorist will tell you that the reason why you need to come to our side is because we are fighting foreign intervention, like in Iraq. Either we want to fight foreign intervention. For example, they're like, oh, there is a US invasion. You have to come to our side because we're fighting for liberation. Or they say we're fighting tyranny. We're fighting, Sisi, or we're fighting Mubarak, or we're fighting Bashar al-Assad, etc. The foreign intervention, on the other hand, what does it say? We're fighting terrorism, or we're fighting to bring democracy. The narratives, again, it's an example of interlocking narratives, but I can tell you that it's not intentional. It's the fact that a lot of the policymakers themselves are clueless about a lot of local issues, a lot of cultural issues. I hope that's a satisfactory answer, but
All right, we have another question here.
First of all, thank you very much. I really enjoyed a lot, and especially when you said animations. So I just really enjoyed more because art doesn't have any boundaries, and so I would like to ask you a very personal question, which is, did you find that your sense of understanding art has changed when you became radicalized? So when you came to the equation of radicalization, did it affect your your sense of art?
Well, it's a recurring theme, by the way, that art counters radicalization. It's a recurring theme that art basically is universal. There's a sense of beauty, and there's a sense when you talk about art, there's also, you lose that kind of black and white mentality. And that's why a lot of the counter-radicalization, the more successful counter-radicalization programs that work, for example, in Tunisia or in Algeria or in Jordan, these are at least the ones that I'm aware of, they involve art training or art education. As for me, I think that my sense of art was one reason why there was a stop. I mean, basically, this is why I didn't go too far. It's very difficult to assess yourself objectively. I think this is a very important point when you talk about radicalized people. It's very difficult to look at yourself objectively. It's actually easier to look at yourself in retrospect. There are things about me, for example, about my radicalization phase that I'm still discovering today. For example, at the time when I was going through it, it felt real. It felt like, it didn't feel, for example, it felt like authentic religious conversion. But now, when I look back, I think, I actually had an identity crisis. I actually was, a Palestinian who born and raised in the Gulf, never had citizenship. I was stateless, and I was kind of confused about where I am. This is something that I'm actually only looking back on. And this is why when you actually go to radicalized people, it's very difficult to ask them. When you actually ask them the question, why are you doing this? Of course they're going to say, because we're doing it for Islam. Of course, that's what they believe. They're not going to say, hey, we have an identity crisis and that's why we actually adopted this narrative. And that's why there's a limit to that kind of interviewing technique when you actually go to a radicalized person and say, tell me more about your beliefs. There's a limit to how much you can expect them to share. But it's a very astute observation that art is actually a part of de-radicalization narratives, and this is something that actually will, if we get to speak more about de-radicalization, we'll have a lot to talk about that.
I have 2 more questions, and if they're not more than that, I will take the last one.
Yes, thank you for your first answer. To have a future, to have a very futuristic question. I don't know about aliens, but automation and basic income are concepts that are getting more wider and wider audience and acceptance, and this will cause new challenges in society. How do you think that will affect, our struggles with identity, and how do you think, is our faith, Islam, will be impacted by it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I come from a region which is ethnically very mixed. And as you know, the Middle East is kind of the cradle of a lot of civilizations. So when it comes to a lot of bad things, we're actually ahead of the curve. Like, for example, when it comes to populism, Europe is grappling with populism right now, but we kind of had our populist period, and it's actually why we're kind of in a mess right now. But it tells you something about where we're coming to the future. Why? Because the Middle East, if you look at the map of the Middle East, all the way, for example, from Morocco all the way to Iraq, there are very few natural borders. It's a flat area. And that's why it was very easy for people to move across. And what this did is that a lot of the people in the region are actually very ethnically mixed. So you cannot, it's very difficult. If I actually sit or stand next to an Israeli Middle Eastern guy, you will not actually tell, if we don't mention who is Palestinian and who's Israeli, you might actually get confused about which is which. It's the same thing that if you look at a Sunni and a Shia next to each other, you can't actually distinguish them because it's not something that is, it doesn't show, right? However, we still have tribalism. We still have it, but it's not based upon ethnicity. It's not based upon, it's basically based upon sectarianism. It's based upon ideology or creed. And I think this is why identity is going to be even more important in the future. We are losing many systems of identity that we relied upon for generations. Very traditional systems of identity are being lost. The systems of belonging. So we went, for example, for living in tribes and clans to living in extended families. And then we went from extended families to nuclear families. And then we went from nuclear families to post-nuclear families. Religious institutions, which are basically communities, are also being dissolved, and we're going from a communitarian understanding of religion to a more personalized religion. So a lot of these, and even the nation state itself is melting away. So in many ways, a lot of these identity systems are actually going away, which is why we're actually craving more identity. And this is why identity is going to be relevant for a very long time. The reason why I started this by referring to the Middle East is that even when tribal differences disappeared, like ethnic differences disappeared, linguistic differences disappeared, etc., we still had tribalism. But it was tribalism based upon what? It was based upon ideology. And I think in the future, as more barriers go down, the importance of ideology and identity is going to go up. And this is going to be a challenge for us in the future.
In a positive or a negative way?
I think in both. I think it's going to be negative. I think it's going to be a challenge. But I think it's also positive in a sense that we can discover more about our shared humanity. I think we can, the more we speak to each other, and the more we mix with other people from different, very, very different, experiences, the more we kind of contextualize our own experience. So we kind of think that we're unique. And then we find that, whatever questions we're grappling with, everyone really grapples with. For example, and this is why, in one of my tribes is basically the human rights community. And in the human rights community, you basically sit with people, you learn from people who are like North Korean human rights defenders. You learn from them, they learn from you. You sit with someone who's from Zambia, for example, and you learn from them, they learn from you. You sit with someone from Colombia, and again, you kind of connect on something. You are not actually from the same tribes in many ways, but when it comes to that particular thing, you feel like there's a lot to learn. There's a lot that I can reflect back on. So it's both positive and negative, but I think it's going to be a challenge.
Salam, everyone. I love it. It is refreshing to hear that you are discussing these issues, radicalization and Islamic reform. I heard a lot of good things, but I think it is missing the focus. I think the diagnosis of the real disease is missing. There are correlations, symptoms, but what is the real virus, the real problem, I think, in this, so far, I listened, perhaps it's not complete. Radicalization, when we look at it, I think it is mostly a Western issue, Western caused. Professor Pape, Chicago University, he did about on 4,000 suicide bombers and attempts, and found out religion is really not the main factor. And found out that the invasions and wars, traumatization, and creating anger, frustration, those kind of things were the major cause, which I do believe. Just 2 days ago, I had a lecture at British Parliament about ISIS. The topic is ISIS, the illegitimate child of 9 beasts. On top, I will put the military-industrial complex, multinational corporations, and goes down, religion goes, to me, the last 2 factors. I want to a little bit talk about, with your permission, on Islamic reform. I entirely disagree with you that Islam is different. It didn't experience, like Christianity, the distortion that Christianity had. I assert, which I have written many books on this topic, that Islam is as distorted, even more distorted than the Christianity, requires more reform than the Christianity. And whatever we are blaming ISIS for doing, it is in the holy books, hadith books, and fiqh books of all Sunni sects and Shiite sects. Therefore, as long as they are considered holy books next to the Quran, whatever you do, whatever I do, window dressing, and do, ultimately they are there, and they will turn back to those books when there is religion. Therefore, I do think we have a very strong, powerful theological argument. So far, no religious scholar is standing. I have on TV, public, with the top religious scholar, he had to escape twice, humiliated in front of the public. He couldn't endure discussion. Another one, the head of theology, theologians in Turkey, he yanked and pulled by force the Quran from my hand because he couldn't. Therefore, there is a very strong theological argument from the Quran regarding reformation, rejecting all hadith and sectarian teaching, and now it is gaining momentum. Right now, tens of thousands, every day I'm receiving about 100, 200 emails saying, I gave up from Sunni and Shiite religion. Otherwise, it is not going to change anything. It will be patchwork, it will be window dressing, it will not take care of the virus.
Okay, so let me start by introducing the audience to Adib Yüksel, who is an author who wrote a lot of books about his view of Islam, which is basically based upon only the Quran. So first of all, we basically ask two questions, or one comment and one question. Maybe on your point about the need for Islamic reform, I think maybe I would clarify what I meant by that is that we didn't have a centralized authority like a Catholic Church, and that's why we cannot compare our history to Christian history. However, I agree with you about Islam going through periods of distortion, and we actually have a manuscript about that, which is basically we bring it down to three distortions or three waves of distortion that it went through. I also agree with you largely when you say that there is a shift, an ideological shift in the Muslim world after ISIS, as a result of ISIS in a sense. So there is increased interest in a lot of heterodox views of Islam and theories. When it comes, however, to radicalization, we try to kind of explain that radicalization does not equal terrorism. Terrorism is only the visible end of, it's the business end of radicalization. Radicalization is not just violent. It can actually be non-violent, and when it's non-violent, in a sense, I don't want to say it's non-violent because it's still violent. But it doesn't really involve that kind of overt attacks like terror attacks. But maybe because you missed the presentation that came before. So there's we can always talk about that in more detail in face to face. But I want to bring it to Ahmed if he wants to any comment that you have.
I just want to add that there are two extremes in the debate, both of which impede our ability to solve the problem. On one side, you have people who say this is entirely ideological. Terrorism comes from scriptures. People read these books and are inspired to go out and commit acts of terror. On the other extreme, there are people who say there's absolutely no relation between religion and terrorism, and you bomb people, they come and bomb you back. The truth is somewhere in between. There needs to be some nuance in the debate because there are push factors and there are pull factors. There are lived realities which confirm to people that violence is something which is going to be very central in their lives. When you're raised in a community which is traumatized, which has been subject to war and destruction, you naturally drift towards those ideas. And when you do that, you tend to look for justification to tell you why engaging in this would be moral and justifiable. And that's where scriptural justifications come in. So the truth is somewhere in the middle.
And we actually have a little bit of research that we did about how sectarianism is not really theology. Sectarianism actually uses theological language, but it's really a power structure. It's not really it can manifest itself in many different ideologies.
I have the last question is for both of you, and then Mahira will come and close the show. We have talked about how to prevent or de-radicalize people, and you mentioned some tools which I feel like will take some time. I mean, it takes time, and both society and government has to cooperate on that, in addition to the Muslim community itself, if you're talking about the Muslim radicalization. If I were a politician and I wanted an immediate action which is effective, with the exception of watching Japanese cartoons, what would it be?
You want to take that?
You're a politician, so you're naturally going to ask for the immediate silver bullet. I don't think one exists. I think we have to accept that this is a long-term thing. And there are solutions that we can start implementing now, and a lot of people complain when we start implementing them. They'll say either this is too soft or this is too harsh. and it won't win you any votes in the short term. But if you want to save your society, it's not about winning votes in the short term.
I would also add that the reason why we have radicalization today is because we had social failure 20 years ago.
Yes, and that brings me to another question. Imagine I'm Margaret Thatcher. What kind of policy could I have implemented then and see the fruits of it today when it comes to this issue?
If you were Margaret Thatcher, I'd warn you about economic policies which might be well-meaning but have an ultimate result of segregating communities and leading to entire neighborhoods where people grow up not seeing people from different cultures, different religions, different backgrounds, and to look instead for ways of creating more intermixing within society so that people confront each other at schools, at workplaces, at sport clubs, and at religious establishments, and get to experience their common humanity.
I mean, it is also a fact that hindsight is 20/20, and it's very easy for us to actually say now that something that happened 30 or 40 years ago led to where we are today. But then we have to ask, what are we doing today that's going to lead to disaster like 30 or 40 years into the future? The fact is that we are at a certain moment of history where we're seeing a lot of global changes, and we're seeing a lot of the order itself, the world order itself is full of broken paradigms. It's full of things which are existing because there are no alternatives yet. And I think that the most productive thing that we can do for our future is really to, instead of standing within the crashing house, trying to stop it from falling, build a new house.
All right. One last final question and quick answer for that. If Trump was Muslim, what kind of Muslim would he have been?
Basically, a Muslim, a democratic kind of ISIS that comes through elections, you know, and basically rise up his own people and says that, you know, there's a war on Eid instead of war on Christmas, and you know, like all of these, people are threatening our way of life.
If Trump was Muslim, he'd be doing exactly what he's doing right now. Step on minorities, silence dissent, build a wall, keep the foreigners out, and make us great again.
All right, good. Thank you.
Well, I'll close the show. I will thank you for the panelists, and I believe it was a very informative discussion. And I would also like to thank you, all of you, to actually engage and ask interesting questions. I hope you all will go back home with some new ideas, and I think our panelists and our moderator will be available after. So no, Osman will not, but the others will. So if you want to stay a little bit to just have a conversation or continue our discussions, you can do that. I would just like to promote a little bit for Minaretten. Look at us up on Facebook, on Twitter, on Snapchat. We don't have Instagram yet, but we will have it. And if you have any questions regarding Minaretten also, you can come to us and ask anything. And thank you for today. It was very good. Thank you.